Okay, so one thing that we want to talk about here that's very, very important to our ritual, to our structure, to everything, is the honoring of the grove, right? Now we see in Tacitus Germania that this is a very big thing. It's a very important part of our worship, that our ancestors, didn't primarily confine the gods within temples, but they primarily used groves. And I mean, we know that they had hofs and we know they had temples, and that was part of their religious belief. We do realize that, in the northern climates, going into a grove wouldn't have always been practical, but we do want to understand what they were talking about when they said these things. And it's mentioned in other accounts too, which we're going to go over. But the one thing that we're looking at when we're trying to realize the sanctity of the grove, and we see this, we can trace this to, there's a lot of Indo-European connections. Hindus have very important groves, very important trees that are important to them and matter very much to their religious structure and their belief. And they had like sacred fig trees and meditation trees and things like that. So we want to try to understand what the sanctity of the grove was. And what we're starting to understand, what we're starting to discover in fleshing a lot of this out, is that it pretty much goes along the same lines as of every model, every sort of worship space model that exists in just about every religion all over the world. All of polytheistic religions and cultural religions have this idea of following their cosmology, right? Now, cosmology is a big thing because it's basically when you're entering into the sacred space, you're entering into the sacred area, you're entering into the world of the gods, into the world of the stories, the world of everything that's being told, when you're being raised up on this culture. So when you enter the space, you're being told the stories of Yggdrasil, and you're being told the stories of the cosmology, and you're being told the stories of the underworld wells your entire life. And then when you perform a bloat, you perform a ritual, you enter into that space, into that cosmological space. And so it becomes something very important. It's something very symbolic, and it sort of, connects to you in a lot of different ways. All right. So we see that. That's what we're looking at, is that Yggdrasil is what, basically the model here. That's why the sacred grove is so important, because Yggdrasil is the cosmology. It is the whole pivotal point of it. And we're going to go over this in this video right here, talking about this and understanding exactly how important this is and why it matters so much. Okay. Now, we do know that the word Yggdrasil means basically the steed of Odin. And it reflects back to Odin's hanging in the tree in Havamal, where he hangs for 9 nights, starving and speared, stabbed by a spear, and he reaches down and obtains the runes, right? Now we're going to go over that and look at that as a cosmological model in comparison with the other sources as well. All right. But one thing we can also consider is that the word Irminsul means basically the pillar of Irmin, or Jormun, which is another name of Odin. And the Irminsul is probably the same word, same meaning as Yggdrasil. And so it's very likely that when we're talking about the sacred pole of the Saxons, that was the Irminsul, that this may have been a substitute for when a sacred tree could not be present, like if you were inside a temple. And we actually believe that there may have been some sort of, there has to be a litmus test on how a tree becomes sacred. How do you consider it sacred? How do you make it something important? And it's very likely that its sanctity would have been its placement near a well. And, that would be connected to the underworld wells. And we actually see that in Adam of Bremen, which we're going to talk about. But, so the Irminsul would be, if you couldn't find a well, you just bring a tree to a well, or bring a pole, bring an Irminsul to a well, or put it within your temple, or wherever you're going to place it that has that sanctified area within it, that isn't within a settlement, isn't within where you live, or you perform the lake, you perform the games and all that stuff. It's within the sacred space, the sacred protected grove. Okay. So when we look at this and we understand, the idea of like human beings being created from trees, and we look at the cosmological connection of Yggdrasil, and we start to flesh out. I mean, so many symbols can come out of this, so much. And I mean, this really converges a lot of our sources. And it's a very powerful symbol for us to see, because you probably are not going to be able to find a source that contradicts this model or this idea, because it brings so many of them together, right? There's so much that we could build upon this. All right. So when you're looking at the cosmological model, what you're seeing here is that the branches of the tree tree are Asgard, okay? The trunk of the tree is Midgard, and the roots of the tree is the underworld, all right? That's our cosmological model. When we break away from Snorri Sturluson's fake model of it being the tree being basically turned on its side with a root in heaven, a root in earth, and a root in hell, I mean, that's just ridiculous. And it's a tree. It's a tree that has roots on the bottom, a trunk, and branches, right? And it may have been, the whole idea of that turning it on its side may have been symbolic. It may have been something where they saw that Christianity toppled the tree, or they may have just seen it as a way to sort of break apart a lot of the symbolism and just make it where it's confusing, or maybe they were just confused. We don't know. But anyway, but the idea is that we do know it was a tree, and we see it from the Poetic Edda that is represented as such. And there were 3 wells in the underworld, and there are 3 roots in the underworld. And this becomes very important. This becomes a part of our entire ritual structure, okay? Because when we're looking at the cosmological model, we understand, like I said, you see Tacitus mentions the sacred grove, the trees in the grove, right? But then you go to Adam of Bremen. Now, Adam of Bremen actually talks about, hanging of sacrifices in trees. And we see that in the Laplanders, they had these birch boats that they would put sacrifice, like the food from the Yule feast, in these little boats, and they would hang them in trees as well. There's a lot of discussion and sources and stuff like that about hanging in trees and the sacrifices going into the branches. The reason why they are doing that, and I mean there's other ones as well. We discussed within the elements, there were burning of sacrifices, burial, drowning, and hanging, right? But when we're looking at hanging, we're looking at the element of air, right? We're looking at Odin's element. Now we know that Odin hangs himself in the world tree, in the Yggdrasil tree, hangs himself from the tree as a sacrifice to himself, of himself to himself, right? And this becomes very, very important because when we're looking at the development of that odor, of drinking of odor, which is what it says specifically in Havamal that Odin does, that he begins to quicken and become wise, and word leads to word, and deed leads to deed, right? He is performing sacrifice in order to be inspired, which is what we've been talking about. This is what is happening, right? And so when you look at this, that the branches of the tree is Asgard, or it's where Odin hung himself. It's the up in the sky, being connected. It's just like the Greeks, they looked at Mount Olympus as like the realm of the gods, the peak of it, because it was something unattainable, something up in the sky, something sacred and holy to them, okay? So they had this model of the branches of the tree that they would look up to, and a lot of the times when you see pole gods and stuff like that, there was the whole idea that you're looking up something majestic, looking up and feeling that power. And even today, if we see like a tall statue or something like that, you can't help but to feel the awe and beauty of that, and how large it is, and how just larger than life, and it connects you to something in your whole spirit, right? And so that's what the purpose of that was. And it's the idea of looking up into the tree, looking up, and you'd have the sacrifices, hanging from the tree, and they were supposed to go to the gods. And that was the idea of it, all right? Then you'd have Midgard, where everybody was standing around as a folk. They would stand around the tree, or stand around, in a circle before it, and that's where they are. They are standing within the element of what they were created, how they were created, the element they were created from, what the gods made in order to make human beings who we are, okay? So that's where they're standing. Now, the altar itself would stand on the roots of Yggdrasil, of the roots of the tree. And the altar then becomes the underworld. The underworld is, all of the elements, and we're going to go into that later on in our video course here. But we're gonna talk about how every single one of the devices that we find on our altar, that we find as sacred implements, somehow connect to an event or a being or a place within the underworld. And so we have like the drinking horn of Aldhumla. Aldhumla was in the underworld before Asgard and Midgard were even created. You have the knife, which represents the sacrifice of Ymir, who was in the underworld. Thor's hammer was made in the underworld in Alfheim. The gander of the Norns the Norns are in the underworld. The bloat bowl represents the underworld fountains, and on and on and on. And so we see this connection of the cosmology, and we see how important it is, and how we see how this whole relationship with this represents the grove of Mimir, right? That's what we are recreating. Mimir's grove sits at the root, the center of Yggdrasil. And that's very important, the center of Yggdrasil. So from the branches is Asgard, in the trunk is Midgard, and then the roots, literally you're standing in Mimer's grove. And so Mimer's grove becomes the grove of renewal. It becomes the grove of regeneration, where Leif and Leifthraser are protected within that grove until Ragnarok. And so the whole cosmology starts to play out in front of your eyes. That is the bloat, right? Now, it's very interesting that in Havamal, when Odin is talking about his sacrifice of himself to himself, he actually mentions some, elements of the bloat structure, which is how we developed our bloat structure. When he asked, do you know how to pray? Do you know how to offer? Do you know how to slaughter? Do you know how to consume? Right? He's asking you, do you know how to do this? And then he tells you at the end of it, don't pray too much. Don't sacrifice too much. All of these strophes, all these verses in Havamal, I think it's from 140 to 147, represent, a bloat structure and how we look at it and how we look at the cosmological model and why we bloat, right? Because we're looking for inspiration. We're looking for word to become word, deed to become deed. And so that's the sanctity of it. That's why it matters, okay? And so when we start looking at all these historic sources and we see how they sacrificed and we see them hanging things in the trees and we see the sanctity of the groves, all of this starts to come together and we start to build a cosmological model that the ritual is structured around. And so it becomes so important and so sanctified, right? So another thing that we look at is the Norns and their libation of the sacred mead upon the root that makes the tree holy. This is another thing. If you have a well around the tree, you pour the libation of the mead or of the water or of the blood onto the root, and it makes it sanctified. It makes it holy. So all of these elements start to come together. You start to see these symbols develop. You start to see it all unfold, right? So we're going to, go over some of the citations here in this video of each source that describes this, so you can start to look at this and you'll start to see in the sources more and more and more of this develop as we continue in our course and in your studies.